What are the challenges that cruise lines are going to have to resolve before they can start cruising again? I'm Gary Bembridge. This is another of my cruising tips for travelers. I want to take a look at the 7 things that I think cruise lines are going to have to do before they're going to be able to start cruising again. These are things that I've seen people talk about. There's some of my own views, and I thought I would share those with you. So what are the 7 big challenges cruise lines face and have to have a plan to resolve? The first big challenge they face is that it's not the cruise line's decision around when they can start up again, because at the moment, certainly at the time of recording this, we have a blanket travel ban. So in the US, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has a stage 4 or category 4, which means that there's no travel allowed at all. In the UK, for example, where I am, the government has a travel advisory which talks about no travel indefinitely. Of course, at some point in time, there will be a date set for travel. I do also think that cruising will be fairly low down on having restrictions lifted because of all the issues that were created and the publicity it got before and during the whole beginning of the shutdown and the lockdown. So one of the big challenges they face is they are not able to be in control of when they want to start cruising again. Now, of course, that's true of all sorts of travels, but I do think we'll see restrictions lifted, perhaps on airlines quicker, train travel, but borders are closed, ports are closed, and I don't see that lifting for a long time. One of the things I guess we've learned through this whole process is that the cruising companies actually do not have as much influence and political sway as perhaps they thought they did, and that's largely come out through the fact that they are not incorporated in countries like the United States or the UK, big cruising ports, or places like Spain where cruises go out of. And they actually have relatively little clout, and that really came to the fore because I guess it was really realized through the whole bailout process that both politicians and the public thought a lot about the fact that these companies are incorporated in tax havens, Panama, Liberia, Bahamas, wherever. And there was a sense that these are not national companies, and also those who are seen as strategic. Cruising is entirely and totally a recreation activity. So they're not in control of when they can start cruising again. I think that's one of the biggest challenges they face, and it's going to be low in priority for authorities to lift those restrictions. That's a big, big challenge. The second challenge that cruise lines face is cruises have become to be seen as not good for public health and relatively unsafe and unpredictable. So cruising was always seen as this great, safe way to travel, unpack once, move around. Of course, what happened during the whole build-up to the shutdown is it was seen a risky place to be from a health perspective, that actually the viruses could spread quite quickly because of the nature that people were contained. It was also seen as very unreliable because of quarantine, so people were worried about being able to get home. They were also then worried about how they would get home and all the risks and dangers and stress of being quarantined far away from home. So they have 2 big challenges to face. First of all, this hostility from the lawmakers, politicians, ports. We even saw ports that have relied historically, or certainly earned, a huge amount of money from cruising and cruise passengers, becoming very hostile. If you take a look at Florida, for example, where you've got the 3 biggest cruise ports in the world, they were very reluctant to take in ships that had issues on board. They started to bring in regulations where they were talking about the Coast Guard not being available to medevac or evacuate crew and passengers, that cruise lines had to organize it much more themselves. They then brought out a restriction which said certainly ships that were still out or had passengers during the lockdown, the crew or passengers coming off those ships can't use commercial flights anymore. It has to be charter flights. So quite a lot of hostility towards the cruise lines. So they face that certainly from the ports and authorities. And of course, the public, there's a real push against cruising by a big sway of people. Certainly what I've seen in the various videos that I've done around the shutdown and cruising is I've seen a large amount of people who are very hostile to cruising and want to see it kind of closed down. I've seen the real die-hard cruisers who are keen to go back, but even when I've asked them, they're really talking about, well, maybe in 2021. I've seen almost half the amount of people I asked about when they thought cruising would start up, when they'd go back. Almost half of those were saying it's into next year. So people are cautious about heading back out to sea. That's a massive big challenge. The cruise lines have to figure out how they're going to overcome that. So I think the third big challenge they face, how can they make sure that nobody who is infected comes on board a ship? What we learned through the whole process is that whatever procedures were in place, and as they tightened up the procedures, they did not work. So for example, if you take Celebrity Apex, this was a ship that hadn't even gone into service, just had crew on board which were helping to get the ship ready for delivery, that had an outbreak on the ship, and that spread through more of the crew on board. So even before passengers didn't come on board, they had an issue. And of course, we know the issues that happened on cruise ships, the very well publicized issues. What's also very important is we saw outbreaks happening even when passengers had been effectively on board for that 14-day normal quarantine period on ships which were stuck at sea for a long time, sailing around the world trying to find a port. One of the things we know is that temperature checks, which is what was happening. So now I went on a cruise quite close to the shutdown. However, what we've learned is that's not particularly helpful, because that only shows up once you have the symptoms. What we've learned from this virus is that, first of all, it takes many days before you actually show any signs, and you may not even show signs. A lot of people who don't actually have any symptoms. So actually temperature checks and is just not going to work. The other thing that cruise lines have historically relied on is basically self-declaration. So you filled out a form, particularly in the old days, it used to be about norovirus or other places that you travel to, and it relied on people being honest. People were not incentivized to be honest on those forms in the old screening process, because if you put, yeah, I've been suffering from diarrhea or vomiting, you were then worried because you knew you're probably going to be locked in your cabin and not actually enjoy your cruise. There was no way that you can get your money back. So there's no incentive for people to be honest. So there's going to have to be a whole new screening process, whether that ends up being medical certificates to show that you're immune, or vaccination certificates when they're eventually available, or some kind of physical screening at embarkation. And to make that work, cruise lines are then also going to have to be much more open and lenient around the embarkation and the cancellation process. So what you're going to have to want to do is, if you are starting to feel ill in a run-up to the cruise, you need to be able to know there's an incentive to actually pull out of the cruise, because you're not going to be penalized and lose 100% or 75% or 90% of your fare. You need to know that when you get to embarkation, if there's an issue and you're screened out medically, that you will get your fare back. So I think there's going to have to be a whole different way of working out a screening process and a boarding process, so they can ensure that people getting onto the ship are not infected, are not going to bring the virus on board. I think this is going to be absolutely key before ports are going to accept cruises. They're going to want to know that the ships coming into their port are not carrying any passengers or crew who are likely to have the virus. The fourth challenge that I think cruise lines are going to face is, how are they going to make sure that once a cruise embarks, that a virus is not imported from a port? If you think about it, when you head out on a cruise and you get into a port, you head out into the port, you're going to be going on tours, you're going to be interacting with vendors in stalls, in shops, loads of people where you go, tourist sites, whatever. So of course there's a real risk that passengers or crew, quite innocently out and interacting, are going to bring it back on board the ship. Now, on an average 7-day cruise, it is still possible, if someone gets it early on, that you could have symptoms and signs later on in the cruise, which then of course triggers all sorts of problems. So the big challenge, I think, for the cruise is how they're going to be able to make sure that they can keep the ship free from virus as they start calling on ports. And I don't know what this is going to mean, but they're going to have to think around how are they going to do that. Whether, certainly when cruising starts again, they're almost going to have to go to no port cruises, or only go to private islands where they can control things much more and test much more. But it's a big, big challenge to see how they're going to wrestle with that. Of course, there's a couple of things we're seeing, and I've seen some stuff, in fact, today that I was recording this from some of the cruise lines, like Genting Cruise Lines, for example, which are Star Cruises, Dream Cruises. They also have Crystal Cruises, where they're looking at the whole process once people embark. So scrapping, for example, self-service at buffet, having only served stuff at the buffet, rigorous cleaning protocols, lifts being cleaned every 2 hours, cabins being wiped down multiple times, equipment being wiped down multiple times. So I think there's going to be massive big changes, and that all has to be put in place before cruisers are going to be able to get approval to start sailing again. One of the other things that I think they're going to have to reassure people on is the whole air conditioning systems, and whether that's actually a way that it spreads, because airborne nature of the way that the virus is spread, and whether the air conditioning actually exacerbated, particularly in relation to the Diamond Princess. One of the things that really stuck out to me in the Genting discussion document they had around what they're changing is, they did talk a lot about air conditioning and how the air conditioning only brought in air from outside, it wasn't recycled air, because I think they realized that both for passengers, and I don't know whether it's true for regulatory, there's a real concern around the efficiency and safety of air conditioning, rightly or wrongly. So those are things I think that are really going to be fundamental, the whole onboard process, and how they're going to reassure and make everyone confident that they're not importing the virus in one port, taking it to another port. And I don't know how they're going to solve that, but I think it's going to be a big, big challenge to solve. I think the fifth area and challenge they need to face is how are they going to reassure passengers and also put in place better procedures and ways of dealing if there is some kind of breakout. I think one of the things they're going to have to do is relook the whole medical center, for example. So medical centers on cruise ships are designed really to basically kind of triage and do basic sort of help, deal and bring medical situations under control. And as soon as they get to the next port, they basically will get people out into the hospital if they need more treatment. So the idea is to kind of stabilize and keep people going. What we discovered, of course, during this whole process is ships have to have much better or very different medical facilities, those that can deal with actually people who need much more care, ventilators or whatever. They need to be able to quarantine people much more in the medical center, and also probably need much bigger medical centers. Even on pretty big ships, the medical centers aren't that large because they don't normally have many patients. Of course, that changed or did change during the whole outbreaks that happened on those few ships where it happened. I think also the whole way of dealing with an outbreak and the relationships with ports, so they don't find that they're constantly locked out of ports as we saw in the outbreak, and reassuring people that if there is an outbreak on board, that people aren't at risk of being stranded at sea in quarantine, not being able to get off ships. Because I see a lot of cases of people who've contacted me saying one of their big reservations about going cruising again is that they're worried that if there is an outbreak, they're then stranded for weeks on end, can't get back into ports, and all the complicated things that happen. That also implies, and I think cruise ships are going to have a much more sophisticated and thorough way of planning ahead in terms of these potential outbreaks. So for example, we saw in some cases in the run-up to the whole lockdown, some governments were sending repatriation flights to help get passengers back home. Governments have basically said that will not be the case moving forward. This is an unusual situation. So I think the whole way of dealing with an outbreak, both on board, the facilities, getting into port, having arrangements with ports around hospitals people can go to or facilities, so if there is an outbreak, things don't happen and deteriorate in terms of what happened on board and what also happened in terms of getting to port, not getting into port, as happened in that whole run-up to the big global shutdown. One of the biggest challenges I think facing cruise lines, certainly for the next year, is how to actually operate and fill ships when older passengers are basically locked out of cruising. In the run-up to the outbreak, all governments, or certainly the major cruising governments, strongly recommend that people over 70 didn't go cruising. In the lockdown, 70-year-olds are being encouraged to stay at home right the way through for many, many months. And it's very unlikely that even if and when cruising are allowed to start operating, that governments are still going to recommend cruising to over 70s. What you have to do now if you're over 70, although it's not happening because of the shutdown at the moment, what you had to do, and it's still applicable, is if you're over 70, you have to get a medical certificate saying that you can cruise. So restrictions on seniors traveling anywhere in the world, whatever form, is going to have to be lifted. Then secondly, what documentation or what they're going to need before they can travel is going to have to be absolutely simple and clear to do. And that is a massive issue because there are many cruise lines that rely very heavily on seniors, and many cruise lines have lots of passengers in their 70s and 80s. River cruising, for example, lots of ocean liners that for much of the year they have a much older profile, and that is potentially locked out. Those people are probably going to be very nervous of traveling, or even not encouraged to travel, or even big restrictions on traveling, like they won't get travel insurance, and their families put lots of pressure on them not to travel. So how can they cruise when a major part of their audience is not going to cruise for a long period of time, probably not until there's vaccines? Another big challenge cruise lines are going to face is passengers being willing to travel because they can't get travel insurance. Now, what we found with travel insurance is there's two critical things. One is that travel policies do not cover pandemic-related incidents. So everything that's been going on and any new thing that breaks out is not going to be covered by travel insurance. So that's a massive issue. The cruise lines have to accept that if there is some issues, they're going to have to cover a lot of those costs. And secondly, there may be more and more challenges or very high premiums if you are buying travel insurance that involves cruising. Already, when you book travel insurance, you need to make sure that it does have cruising cover, because there are potentially some really big costs. If you fall ill, not related to pandemic, you fall ill, or you need to be evacuated from a ship, or you need to be repatriated. There's quite a lot of costs involved with that whole process. So sometimes there's an extra premium. So people are going to be very nervous to travel without travel insurance covering non-pandemic stuff, as well as what happens if things break out and there is a pandemic. One of the solutions may end up being that cruise lines are going to have to build some kind of guarantees and insurance into their fares, covering whether it's pandemic related stuff or non-pandemic related stuff. So for example, in the UK, Saga Cruises, they actually build insurance into their fares because they have traditionally had an old audience because they target 50 plus, but they've had many people in their 70s and 80s that struggle to get travel insurance as it is, even before all of these issues. So I think there's a lot of challenges that cruise lines have to solve to really get the authorities on board, governments on board, and ports on board before people are going to be willing to let people embark ships and set sail around the world. Do you have any other thoughts in terms of what the challenges that cruise lines are going to face before they start cruising again? Please feel to comment and have a discussion, and of course try and keep it as friendly and civil and good as we can keep a discussion. It's good to hear what people think. If you want to find out much more about cruising, I have loads more videos about cruising, both in the short term, the long term, and of course if you're looking at inspiration for future cruising once we past all of this and the challenges are solved, I have loads more on my channel, so why don't you watch another one of those right now.